Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay. I am a toddler whisperer, a parent coach, and a speech therapist. And today I'm excited and delighted to be joined by Marian Flaxman. Marian, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So, we are going to talk about lots of things related to complicated kids food wise. We're going to talk about food today. But before we do that, I want you to kind of set the scene for us, introduce yourself, who you are, and why you're here.
Wonderful. Well, I'm here because somebody hit me with their car, but that's a long story. So, I'm Marian Flaxman. I am a health and nutrition policy consultant. I'm also a certified holistic health counselor and a former natural food industry sales girl and restaurant manager. So, when it comes to healthy food and nutrition, I've kind of worked on every side of the ball. Right now, I'm focused more at the policy level, trying to advance food as medicine and healthy nutrition policies and education. But I've worked one on one as a personal chef and as a health coach. I have owned and operated healthy food restaurants. And I also have been a mom for 18 years. And during those 18 years, have used my knowledge of food and nutrition to heal and support my three daughters. So I'm very passionate about this topic of healthy food and kids and just healthy living in general.
And one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on the podcast is because you have had these three children and you have had very different experiences with them. And I think the part that struck me the most actually when we first met was you started to tell me something about your first child, and I'll let you do that in a second. But you did something that is not common, and I think it's something that the listeners will take heart in or take a note from you about, which is the doctors said, and again, I'm going to let you tell the good people what was going on, but the doctors were like, she's fine. And you knew that she was not fine. So I'm going to let you expand, but like you started out not listening to what the doctors were telling you.
Yes, lesson one of my story is definitely that when you're a young, rebellious mom, you're much more willing to push back against the sort of medical authorities because it is very difficult in our culture. Doctors are very respected and authoritative, and it's hard to question a doctor or push back unless you're a 19-year-old mom who has a baby who's fussy and rashy, and you're so focused on this little baby because you're 19. Nobody is going, this person's at high risk for having a child with issues. I was well supported. I had a family that was helping me out. I had access to whatever a person might need access to. I had a healthy, natural home birth. And then here's my beautiful 8-pound baby, and she just can't stop seeming agitated and uncomfortable. That's really what it was to me. It was like she just seemed uncomfortable. And the doctors were very quick to say, it's colic. And again, I'm like 19 years old. I'm like, what is colic? Like, there's just this thing where a baby cries for hours every day, and you just go, yeah, that's what they do. That did not sit right with me. And so, being a young person, very internet fluent, and lucky for me, it was 2006, so there was such a thing as Google, and I was able to kind of just turn to the internet and say, my baby is fussy, I'm nursing her, it seems like my breast milk maybe is bothering her. I'm not quite sure what my inquiry was, but I got a lot of information back on your baby could actually be allergic to your breast milk. Your baby could actually be irritated by breast milk for a variety of reasons. There is a plausible hypothesis that your baby is experiencing distress due to something in your breast milk. And so just getting that little nugget that let me know that my sort of gut instinct wasn't crazy, and that it in fact was not just normal to let a baby cry for hours on end because they have colic, whatever that mysterious thing might be, it set me down this path. So I decided to try an elimination diet. And we're talking a full-blown elimination diet. Like,
Okay,
I
pause,
literally,
because you don't do things halfway.
yes,
So,
I'm not, I do moderation in moderation. So in that way, I'm very moderate. But I often describe myself as a moderate radical and a radical moderate. So depending on the context. But I took my diet down to brown rice, zucchini, and olive oil. That was it for 1 week. And keep in mind, I was nursing at this point like a 12-pound baby. So if you want a tip on how to lose the baby weight, folks, that's it. Just starve while nursing. It
This is
works.
this is not medical advice.
Not medical advice. And it was
But
very, very
listen,
hard.
but the fact that, right, this is a decision that you made just to see you were
It was an experiment.
yeah.
It had nothing to do with like how I was going to eat long term. The question was, if I take my diet down to just sustenance, just I can get by, I'm going to survive for a week. And I ate a lot of olive oil, by the way. I was not really in a deficit per se. I was consuming a lot of extra virgin olive oil. But if I take my diet down to olive oil, rice, and zucchini, will my baby respond? And within 24 hours, this grumpy, fussy, oh, she has colic, this baby was smiling. I have this one photo of her that I will never forget, was the first picture of her just sitting there comfortable and happy, not agitated, not needing to be bounced and shushed and all those things, just chilling.
Okay, pause. One of the reasons why this podcast is called the Complicated Kids Podcast is because childhood, babyhood is meant to look like that version of your daughter, the happy, bouncy, smiley version, not the fretful, uncomfortable, agitated version. And when we have kids who are chronically agitated, it's not that kids don't get agitated, of course they do. Their diaper is, a mess, they're overtired, whatever, overstimulated. As a rule, though, as a personality trait, no, that's not what we're going for. And okay, people are going to call me out on that one too. There are personalities that are more reactive and less
Sure.
reactive. But as a permanent state, are we meant to be uncomfortable in our own skins? No, absolutely not.
Well, and that makes me think about stress response, right? Stress response is so adaptive and healthy. If something stressful happens and your body rushes all these chemicals and hormones and inflammatory compounds into your system to respond to that stress, that is perfect. That is beautiful. Of course, if a baby's diaper is full, they should cry. They should appear agitated. But it's that chronic stress that leads to that chronic inflammation that breaks us down and ruins everyone's health right now. Similarly, for a baby, if there's a chronic agitation, not only is that not a healthy, normal state 24 hours a day, but it's actually disrupting our ability to understand their signals when we need to understand them. And in my case, it was making it very challenging to know, when is my baby tired, right? Because how can you tell if a baby is constantly irritated and fidgeting and rubbing their face? Well, how are you going to catch that very subtle signal when they turn from bubbly to kind of like doing the gentle rubbing that tells you, time for a nap? You can't notice that if they're so agitated all the time. And so for me, being able to, again, with just simply taking every major allergen out of my diet, and there's a wide variety of reasons why I was in such a sensitive state and she was in such a sensitive state. But for us in that moment, it became clear that proteins in my breast milk were irritating her gut, her nervous system, and that was leading to this agitated state. So over the period of like the entire rest of the year, I slowly added things back and was able to more closely identify what those irritating proteins were, which allowed me to have a much broader diet. I wasn't living on zucchini forever. It was just a week. But I learned so much from that process. And to this day, for anyone experiencing something really dramatic that may or may not be alterable through diet, I am a big fan of trying as much as possible to take everything out and then add it back, because it's so much easier to differentiate signal from noise when you start with that blank slate.
Yeah. And so, okay, fast forward a little bit, because you weren't done there, apparently.
Not done. The
Because
kids
you
just
had
kept
a
on
very
coming.
complicated kid.
Yes. And then I had my second daughter, who was definitely my hardiest and like easiest baby, partially because I applied so much of what I learned from my first daughter to my second. I was working on diversifying her microbiome from day one. We literally got a puppy when she was 3 months old, and we were like putting her and the puppy together to get her all those good germs. I was giving her fermented foods, like, titrating tiny amounts of kombucha under her little baby tongue. I took microbiome diversification with my second very seriously, and consequently, her nervous system was the calmest. She was a much better sleeper. She was just a happy, healthy, chunky baby from very early on. I did do something that is controversial, which is that I omitted the top three major allergens from my diet for the first year while nursing her in order to just try to prevent any kind of allergenicity response development in her, knowing her predisposition. And that worked for us. She has no food allergies.
Why was that controversial?
Because right now, some people in the allergy space say that if you want to prevent allergies in a high risk child, you should actually dose them with allergens early on.
Yeah.
But I think of it as like if I know that my baby is predisposed to a leaky gut that might allow allergens to cross into her bloodstream, I'm going to focus on sealing her gut before I focus on introduction. And that was the approach that I took. And again, it worked for her. She's had neither of my other children have any true food allergies. But with her, because she started so healthy, I learned a new thing on top of this knowledge about just the power of food in general, which was that food impacted her mood. So this is a happy baby, happy toddler, very smart, very verbal. And then you go to grandma's house and she has access to these processed foods that she wouldn't normally have at my house. And she became just nasty, like moody, grumpy, tantrumy. When I was a kid, I was a tantrum thrower. I was the lying on the ground, beating fists into the ground, like, I hate you, I hate you. That was me. Sorry, Mom. Not my children. We've almost never had a tantrum in our lives. Which I credit to the way that they eat. But I saw firsthand when she was exposed to like normal foods, processed junk, instant tantrum. So I went, whoa, food can really affect mood. That was a big aha moment. And then my third daughter is my truly complicated kid because when she was a sweet little toddler, barely even a toddler, crawling around, she crawled up on top of like a little box and then just fell backwards and hit right on the back of her head and suffered essentially an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury. Undiagnosed because we took her to the doctor and the basic protocol is like monitor for a couple hours, see how they're doing. She seemed fine, but after we took her home, we noticed that something had changed in her brain. Anytime she cried, she would projectile vomit. It was like the wires were crossed. And it wasn't just like if she cried for a prolonged period of time or if you left her to cry in a crib or something. Anytime she cried, fall and bump the knee, cries for 3 seconds, vomiting. It was a very messy time. And it was very confusing. As a mom, you're like, okay, obviously something weird is happening, but no one can really point to this otherwise healthy seeming baby and explain to me what's going on. Her sleep deteriorated, but of course it was right around that kind of classic sleep regression time. So the pediatrician just said, she's manipulating you. You should just let her cry it out. And I said, when she cries for 3 seconds, she projectile vomits. And they said, just leave her in her vomit and she'll stop doing that.
And this is an extreme example of why if your little voice in your head, usually it lives in your gut, if your gut is telling you that that is terrible advice, it is terrible advice. Not because that's true, capital T, but because it's not true for you and your baby or your child, right? Like there are many of these interactions with well-meaning professionals who usually don't have the training on the subject that they're telling, on which they're giving you advice. And pediatricians, I don't throw pediatricians under the bus because they keep the tiny humans alive, but they are not specialists and they don't know everything, and they shouldn't have to know everything, but they should refer more often than they do. And yeah, so that to you felt like I'm just having like a horror response over here,
Yeah, well,
right?
very much. I also had a horror response. And I think, you and I have talked, and perhaps you've shared with like your listeners that when you're someone who is like educated and nuanced and healthy enough, sometimes it can actually stand in your way of getting good health care because when you come across as healthier than average, doctors don't quite know what to do with you if you say, like, I don't feel my best. So, like in my case, I've had the experience of saying, like, I feel really inflamed, my joints hurt, and the doctor is like, your cholesterol looks fine, your blood pressure is fine, you're a healthy body weight, see you next year. Similarly, with my kids, I think that pediatricians maybe would be more inclined to refer if there was an obvious speech delay or an obvious learning delay or an obvious growth delay. But here are my kids showing up and I'm like, hey, she's not sleeping and she throws up a lot. And they're like, well, she's pretty, she's talking, she's, like sometimes kids don't sleep for a few years, like, sorry. And so I think her being like generally above average because of all the other work that I was putting in to try to keep her well, it actually stood in the way. Like, I don't necessarily fault the pediatrician because it's difficult when you're seeing a lot of kids to know like who's really slipping and needs to get that special care.
Yeah.
And when kids present as like healthier than average, even when the parent is reporting a problem, you may not see the problem because it feels like their health is still above average.
Yeah. Okay, so girl is vomiting, not sleeping very well. She's had this traumatic brain injury. Food is the answer here?
Yes. So this is where, I don't know, Jesus takes the wheel or the universe intervenes. Like some magic fairy dust is sprinkled from the universe because I decided at this point, like an absolute crazy person, to return to school. I had a toddler who wasn't sleeping. I had a husband that was traveling for work a lot. And I thought this is a great time to go back and study more. I'm going to get another degree. So I did that. I enrolled in school. And very fortunately, I went to American University. I was studying public health. And in one of my first classes, I mentioned that I was a former chef. And my professor immediately reached out to me and said, you should come be a research assistant in the lab of nutritional neuroscience. And I thought, nutritional neuroscience? Like, yes, please. What is that? And that's how I got introduced to the work of Dr. Katie Holton and the low glutamate diet. And when I learned about glutamate, my entire life changed and my daughter's life was basically saved. That sounds a little dramatic, but I don't know how much longer healing from her brain injury would have taken if I hadn't learned about glutamate. And I don't know what injuries and perhaps neuronal death might have been caused from long-term overexcitation. So
And this is the thing about early intervention. It's true of anybody who undergoes early treatment for anything, really, is you can't prove the negative. And so I have a similar experience with my daughter who had sensory processing issues early in life. I took her to physical therapy, occupational therapy. By the time she was 3, she was finished in intervention and she was a functional toddler in a way that she had not been before. My what if story is that kid would have been, can't prove a negative, but in my heart of hearts, I believe this, anxious. She would have been anxious. She would have been fretful. She would have been avoidant. She would have been introverted, internally, sort of locked because of the world being too much for her. And because we educated her brain as to actually the world is manageable and there are hard things that you can learn how to do, that she's applied that mindset to her entire life. And now she's gonna hike the Appalachian Trail by herself following high school,
Amazing.
right? So like, but again, we can't prove a negative. In the same way, you know, I believe you, Marian. Low glutamate saved your daughter's life. But why don't we all know about glutamate, for example, or any of this other stuff? Why don't people do an elimination diet when their child is very fussy?
I think that broadly speaking, medical education has not included nutrition education. So that's the first barrier, is that we turn to our doctors for advice about health and they have advice about medicine. And those are related but different things. There is also a shortage of dietitians, and so doctors who even might understand that a patient could benefit from a dietitian referral often don't make them. And then, of course, dietitians are basically given a broad training that can be useful for things like weight loss, weight management. Perhaps some of them are specialists in things like type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, but they're not usually specialists in things like diets that benefit neurotransmission. So, the low glutamate diet, as designed and operated by the Nutritional Neuroscience Lab and Dr. Katie Holton, was designed in response to Dr. Holton basically being a curious mom who had a friend with a chronic health condition that seemed unsolvable. And for some reason, she just got very curious about it and spent a lot of time thinking about what are all these things, all these symptoms that she's experiencing, what do they have in common? Well, a lot of what they had in common was disruptions to GABA and glutamate signaling in the brain, which is actually really common in things like autism, in things like ADHD, in things like anxiety. There are issues with GABA and glutamate neurotransmission. GABA is calming and glutamate is excitatory. And that's a good thing when it's happening in a balanced way. But when glutamate is over excitatory, when there's too much glutamate, it can feel like panic, it can feel like anxiety, it can feel like stress, it can feel like a seizure, it can feel like a migraine. There are many ways that glutamate overexcitation can present, including things like sleep disturbances. So, Dr. Holton developed this low glutamate diet when she realized that the many symptoms her friend was experiencing, things like headaches, things like chronic pain, all seemed to be rooted in glutamate transmission, and that in a healthy diet, and even sort of specifically in an overtly healthy diet, someone who is going out of their way to eat healthy, dietary free glutamate, or glutamate that has been unbound from a whole protein structure and is now free as it enters the mouth and the digestive tract, dietary free glutamate can be abundant in a diet that is mindfully healthier than average. It can also be abundant in a junk food diet, but her friend was like a fitness person and is having all these issues, right? So I learned about the low glutamate diet, and Dr. Holton says to me, "Oh, like you're not sleeping? How come?" And I'm like, "Oh, my toddler hasn't slept in 2 years, so it is what it is. It's a war out there, hashtag motherhood." And she's like, "No, that's not right." You know, she was unwilling to settle for what I was settling for as a means of just surviving. And I want to add very quickly, because you and I have discussed this as well, every family has a different capacity for different things. It happens that in this phase of our lives, we had just figured out how not to sleep. And that was just what we needed to do to get by, right? Like, it wasn't as simple as typing in, like when I typed in, like, why is my baby fussy? I'm breastfeeding. I found some articles about, maybe an elimination diet. But when you type in, like, toddler not sleeping, good luck. That's an absolute hellscape of articles. Like, there's 10 million hits and none of them are helpful. It's like, have you tried just the most basic stuff? You're like, yes, I've tried that. Thank you.
And
So,
listen, I think this is so interesting, right? Because for this period of time, you were like, well, we just gotta like hunker down and get through this. And which is, I think part of the reason it's interesting to me is there are moments in one's life when one is available for solutions. And there are moments in one's life when one is not available for solutions, though they may be fantastic. We're just not ready. Timing is everything. And it has to feel doable. So, yes, I just want, because what I don't want people to take away from this conversation is like, well, okay, I got to do elimination diet and I got to like eat healthy, and that might not even work.
Right.
Like, that's not what we're saying here. And again, this is not nutritional or medical advice. What it is the reason I wanted to have you, Marian, is because it is a story of curiosity, of perseverance, of asking different questions than the ones that were being answered. Right? You were asking questions and getting answers that were unsatisfactory. And so, with pauses and stops and starts, you have moved forward through this journey. So, but again, like, even I have gone on the internet and typed dietary free glutamate. There is remarkably little to be had.
Right.
And I knew to look for it.
Right. Exactly. And actually, because glutamate does play a really big role in processed foods, there's a lot of propaganda that's pro glutamate, which is tricky as well. Like last year, the Whole30 diet was like, you can now use MSG on Whole30, no problem. And I actually wrote to the founder of the Whole30, and she and I had a long back and forth. I was like, I work in a lab of nutritional neuroscience. Like, this is terrible advice. But she was trying to be progressive and say, well, the basic evidence says that MSG is not toxic, but it's a step backwards when we're having wellness professionals recommending food additives in that way. But the word curiosity is absolutely everything to me. And I think that I've been very fortunate to have had the support to remain curious. I have, for example, this is like really basic, but I've had a husband for whom when I say, hey, I'm going to totally change our kids' diet, he's like, I like, I know there are a lot of husbands that don't. I have a lot of mom friends who are like, my husband's always pushing back. He wants to take the kids to McDonald's. It's part of how he grew up. It's like it's like a bonding thing. And I've been fortunate to have this sort of like immediate deferring from my husband when it comes to anything healing, anything diet. He's like, you take the wheel. So,
and let's pause here for a second, because this is real. Like, if you have a spouse who is saying, okay, I'm in, that is a completely different scenario than the spouse, who wants to take the kids to McDonald's. But we should also add here, McDonald's in 2024 is not your 1976 McDonald's or even your 1982 McDonald's. It is,
sadly not.
Those are different. So like, that's a whole other topic, I think. But in the same way that YouTube is not Saturday morning cartoons.
Right.
And again, you get to decide what to do about that. But let's not compare the two. Let's not say, oh, I watched TV all the time and I was fine, and say that therefore YouTube is okay for my kids. Those are not apples to apples.
Right.
Exactly. And there are no apples at McDonald's.
Exactly. Although maybe some sliced in a bag with citric acid and water.
Oh, yeah.
But I think like I'm always sort of careful when I talk about my experience to be honest that nothing that I've done has been quote unquote easy, and everything that I've done has been supported by people in my life who trusted me to know enough to make these changes. And I think for a lot of moms, like you recently said, not every parent needs to be a child psychology expert, but it would be nice. For me, like not every mom with a complicated kid needs to be a nutrition and, how nutrition impacts the nervous system and microbiome expert, but it is nice. It does make it a lot easier. When I have a question, I'm going to PubMed and I'm reading research papers, and I know how to read those papers, and I like to read those papers. I find it fun. If you don't find that fun and that makes your nervous system shut down, it's going to be very difficult to get anywhere. And there's not a lot of great support out there if you have these kinds of questions. Like, why is my kid seemingly so sensitive to these foods? Or why aren't they sleeping? Or why are they agitated in the afternoons? Or whatever the question is, there aren't a lot of easy ways to get answers. And the answers that are easy are usually very noisy and very profit driven and very like not sustainable. So I think that what I like about the journey that I've been on is that I've been able to put my own learning based on my own health struggles. I took that into academia. And then from what I got out of academia, I've been able to bring that back to my family and use that again. But I know how unique that is. Like, I know not every mom is like, I think I'll go get a master's degree from Georgetown in biomedical science. Like, casually. That's kind of a big undertaking. So I've been very, very fortunate to be able to blend the personal and the professional in this way. But it's also why I love to share the information with others, because there are some very simple changes. In my case, and I will just quickly wrap back to this story, Dr. Holton said to me, have you tried putting your littlest, Frida, on a low glutamate diet? And I'm thinking, well, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? Like, this chick does the low glutamate diet, so of course she's going to suggest it for me. But like, I'm a healthy mom. I feed my kids healthy. Of course, if something dietarily could be done, I'm doing it. Me, of course. And so I'm like, well, we're pretty much already on a low glutamate diet. Like, what is that even? And we go through my diet, like what Frida's having every day, and she was taking one gummy vitamin every day that had gelatin. And like every few days, she was having a smoothie with collagen protein. And I'm thinking, collagen protein, great for your gut, gummy vitamin, got all the good methyl B's her nervous system needs. Like, I'm an expert. And Dr. Holton is like, glutamate. These are sources of dietary free glutamate. If she has a traumatic brain injury, she may be having this glutamate cross her blood-brain barrier, act on her brain, causing overexcitation, leading to all these symptoms, including lack of sleep. And I'm like, fine, I'll try anything once. So we cut out the isolated proteins, we cut out the gummy vitamin, and she slept 12 hours straight it was 2 days later. She slept 12 hours straight. And I was like, well, it's not nothing. So that's when I really kind of got even more curious, right? I learned this sort of higher level of the role that food, quote unquote, can play in health. I already knew that food impacted health. I knew that from myself. I knew it from my first daughter. I knew that food could change your mood from my second daughter. But it wasn't until my third daughter that I realized that certain foods, under certain conditions, can actually alter the functioning of your nervous system. And that was a huge awakening for me. So glutamate is not something that every single person is sensitive to, but it is something that many people can become sensitive to. And I'm just going to plug my podcast interview with Dr. Holton, because she does a great description of how enough stress is enough. It can be something like a traumatic incident that causes PTSD. It can be something like a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, but it can also be 5 years where your job is kicking your butt, your kids aren't sleeping, and you get a divorce. Like, it can be the compounding life stress of your 30s, 40s, 50s.
And I think
So,
this is where it gets complicated for people, because there is bioindividuality,
right,
meaning my system is not the same as your system, even if we're, demographically and geographically and dietarily similar. Those are not the same. And then there's this threshold. I don't know, is it called a hypothesis? I consider it, a threshold issue of like, okay, my system, me as an organism, I've got a bandwidth, right? I've got a tolerance for stress, for changes in my diet, for sleep variability, for any number of things, right? For conflict, I've got a tolerance. I've got a bandwidth. If I'm not sleeping, If I'm not eating well, then that's leaving less room in the bandwidth for the conflict part of it. And so
Right.
somebody leaves a dirty glass on the table, and now I've tripped into outside of my bandwidth. I'm having a meltdown. Right? I am in fight, flight, or freeze. My nervous system is triggered. Why? Because leaving a glass on the table is terrible? No, because I don't have anything left.
Right.
And the kids that I see in my practice, and the kids for whom this podcast is designed, are these kids. They have small thresholds to begin with, small bandwidths to begin with, and then their systems are crowded with irritants, environmental, food, whatever, internal, neurological, and they're constantly being tripped into that state of stress. But nobody really can explain in a way that fits everybody why that is, because it's individual.
Right. Yes. And I think that there's also this metaphor of like the bucket. And, we live in a society that's bombarding us with stressful images and messages, and then there's environmental toxins, and there are contagious illness, viruses, bacteria, and then there's food and too much sugar and inflammatory fats. And we all have varying levels of tolerance for all of this onslaught of just basically, let's call it stress. But at a certain point, your bucket will overflow. And due to that bio-individuality and socioeconomic individuality, the overflowing of the bucket is going to look different for everyone. So I think, like, in some ways, I have a really big bucket. Like, I was able to return to school functioning on zero sleep. I had a 4.0, and I think I was a pretty present mom. And I'm not a big yeller, but like, I was battling a skin rash off and on. Like, I was having some eczema flaring up, right? And then I noticed that I too was becoming really sensitive to glutamate. And it's not something I was always sensitive to. I used to work as a protein shake sales girl, and I was just drinking protein shakes like they were going out of style. It was just a liquid glutamate bomb, just right to the brain, day in and day out. I didn't have migraines. I didn't have sleep issues. I didn't have anxiety. I felt fine. I felt great. If I drank that shake in the middle of my time in school when I was functioning on 3 hours of sleep and I was worried about my kids and I'm cranking out term papers, I would have had a full blown panic attack in response to that because my ability to metabolize glutamate was gone. My internal glutamate production was so high that there was no room for external dietary glutamate. But just a few years earlier, under very different conditions, I was drinking these protein shakes, no problem. So, again, adding to the complexity is that people change. There's really no, I think one of the things that I come up against a lot as as a health coach and someone that people turn to for nutrition advice is that there is literally not a single diet that I would recommend to every person under every condition for all time. There are only a wide variety of alterations and things to remove, things to add, tweaks that I could suggest to many people under many conditions. But even the diet that I eat today does not look the same as the diet I ate 1 year ago, or the diet I ate 3 months ago, or even maybe yesterday. Everything is relative to stress, it's relative to sleep, it's relative to movement, it's relative to needs. And the same is true for little kids. Like, kids that have had a really long day at the pool are going to have a much higher tolerance for example, carbohydrates than a child that's been sitting on the couch all day.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say tolerance, they're gonna metabolize that more easily, and you're not gonna see the behavioral disturbance from a kid who's been in the pool all day because they're tired and they
Exactly.
need that. Yeah. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, when you've been in a pool all day, not just, burning calories, but literally just depleting all of your glycogen stores. Your muscles are not full of glycogen, your liver has been emptied. Your body is now like a sponge ready to receive an abundance of carbohydrates in a way that a person sitting around all day glycogen is fully filled, you inundate that body with glucose or sucrose, and it's going to just be turned into fat, which is fine and could be okay. You know, if it's happening once in a while, it's fine. Fat is a useful energy source, but everyone has a different tolerance, and that tolerance, as we were saying, might be seasonal, it might be stress induced, but it could even be day to day activity based.
Yes.
So it is, and again, to sort of throw it back to having compassion for practitioners, the average pediatrician does not have time to sit down with a patient and say, let's go over what your life looks like every month. Give me a snapshot of these 30 different days. Each one is a unique case. And let's talk about how your diet and lifestyle could be impacting your health across a 30-day span. Like, I would love to have that conversation with everyone I meet, but a pediatrician is not being paid by the insurance companies to have that conversation. So, whether or not they would love to or know in their heart that it's important,
Yeah.
it's not in their scope.
And this is where I will also plug your podcast. This is where you sit sort of in the space, which is how are people affected by public policy, in particular health policy, and how does that play out? And you know, what are the wonks thinking? What are the people thinking? And how are those two the same or different? And lots of times they're different.
Right, right. And there
um,
are some things that, like, as a food allergy mom, because my oldest has some anaphylactic allergies, which is why it became so important to me to prevent them in my younger ones. There are populations, disease states, and populations that grow to a place where policy interventions make sense. I find it very exciting that there's now a mandate for EpiPens to be in every school in Maryland. That's wonderful, especially because allergies can actually start at any time. You can develop a new allergy, it happens all the time. But of course, are we going to pass legislation where there's a big red label on foods that says this contains dietary free glutamate? No, we're not going to get that passed. It wouldn't make sense. I'm passionate about the low glutamate diet and educating people about it who need it, but I would never introduce that policy because some things need to be worked on at a policy level and other things really have to be addressed one on one with practitioners, with dietitians, nutritionists, coaches, and we just have to be okay with having a tolerance for all the different levels of care that are required. We can't be so fixated on policy level changes that we lose sight of the groundwork, and we can't be so fixated on the boots on the groundwork that we think, what's the point of policy changes, right? We do need policies that make healthy whole foods more accessible, but they're not going to have a label that explains glutamate. That can't be done at the policy level.
if people want, because I'm aware that we've kind of covered a lot of ground here, and maybe in some what appear to be in extreme ways. If there's one step, like one thing that a parent of a complicated kid wants to know or do, what would that be?
Can I say two things?
Yes.
So the first thing that I wish more people understood is that when we are using diet to change health outcomes, and that includes behavioral and like neurological health,
Mhm.
there are time frames that become very important. So somebody will say to me, "Oh, I tried going gluten free for a couple days, didn't feel any different, so it's not for me." When I first went gluten free, I was very, very sick. And I think that I probably didn't feel fully better from it for at least 6 months. Now, I was an extreme case, and we didn't go into all the ways that my body was destroyed by antibiotics, and it was like a long journey back to normalcy. But if you're going to try a dietary change, you need to give it a month. It is what it is. It's not easy advice, but dietary change, because what happens is it's not just about removing the offensive thing, offensive meaning irritating, right?
Mhm.
it's not just about the removal. It's about the healing your body then has to accomplish once that thing has been removed. So you may not feel better just from removing it, and that's okay because the thing that's making you feel bad needs some time to heal. We can't expect our bodies to go, "Oh, you cut out that irritant? Well, great. I'm all better. Thanks. Thanks, chief." There's no way.
Yeah.
So, the number one thing would be that healing takes time. A pill might give you an immediate result, but healing takes time.
Mhm.
So if you're like so at the end of your rope, so frustrated, you've tried everything, this pill, that pill, and you're like, I'm here, I'm going to try a dietary change, you need to give it a month. And so because of that, the second thing that I would say is pick the approach that feels easiest to you. You can Google, as I did many times, how should I change my diet to make this better, that better? And you'll have 100 different experts give you 100 different ideas, and they may all feel overwhelming and terrible. Pick the version of it that feels easiest to you. For me, that has always been cut everything out and then add it back in. Partially because I'm kind of an extremist, but partially because I love the simplicity and the elegance of it. If you start from nothing, then you know exactly what you're working with.
It's a
But for
very
someone else,
scientific approach.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
But for somebody else, it might be the opposite. It might be this month I'm cutting out gluten, but we're
Yep.
going to eat dairy, we're going to eat sugar, we're going to eat everything else normal. We're not going to worry about quality, we're not going to worry about organic. We're just going gluten free for a month. You can still learn a lot from that approach as long as you're willing to give it that full month. So, number one, be patient and commit to the time.
Mhm.
And number two, pick the approach that is going to be the least overwhelming for you. Keep it as simple as you need to be able to commit, because there's no point in choosing a version that will force you to be constantly doing negative self talk. I'm terrible at this. I'm not a good cook. I've never been a good cook. It's like, don't do that to yourself. There is no point. A lot of people come to me and ask for advice on recipes, and I'm like, I literally just chop up vegetables and roast them. It's not like, don't bully yourself into thinking you have to like follow these mommy bloggers who are making like 4-step meals. Don't do it. Just find the way that makes it the least stressful for you. And if that's buying pre-cut fruit, buy the pre-cut fruit.
Yeah.
Like, do the thing that gets you to be able to make that change.
Keep it simple.
Keep it as simple as works for you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Everyone's different.
Um, Marian, if people want to know more about you, can they work with you?
They can. Yeah, I do a wide variety of things. So I actually do some cooking lessons if people do need that kind of hands-on support. I teach people how to bake gluten-free sourdough bread, which is very fun. It's also top 10 allergen-free, so don't worry, my sensitive kiddos, I've got your back. I can teach you how to bake birthday cakes that taste just like the real thing, but are totally top 10 allergen free. That's something I've been doing for almost 20 years, so I'm very passionate about that. But I also work with people one on one as a health coach. And then, you know, I have a great podcast, which you were a fabulous guest on, that people can absolutely learn more about me there. And as you mentioned, my passion through the podcast is restoring personal narratives to public health, because public health is just conversations about things that millions of people are experiencing, but those millions of people, every single one of them are people, are a person having a personal health experience. So we talk about public health, numbers, big picture, statistics, epidemiology, and I like to really bring it back to the individuals who are affected, who have had personal journeys, because every single story matters and every single story is relevant when it comes to big public health topics.
Yep. Awesome. And we will link to all of that in the show notes. So, oh my God, you and I could go on for days, but we're going to pin it here. And Marian Flaxman, thank you for coming on the podcast.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.